presenter is Alan Nowicki, who is the Director of Programming at the National Historic Landmark Roycroft campus. He has been a teacher for more than 25 years, having taught in every grade level from pre-K through college, specializing in art and history. A regular speaker at local schools, libraries, churches, and historical sites around Western New York. Recent presentations have included talks at Buffalo History Museum, Iowa State University, the Folger Shakespeare Conference, and the Smithsonian. So I am happy to turn the microphone over to Alan.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I had them turn the lights down in case anyone needs to take a nap. It's that kind of a day today, kind of dreary outside. So I always like to ask this question before I start this presentation. Who owns a pair of Mickey Mouse ears? Only one person? 2 people? Very disappointing. I think this is the 4th time I've done this, and I usually have like 1 or 2 people that don't own Mickey Mouse ears. So I think maybe Lancaster Senior Center needs to do a field trip down to Disney World or something. How about a coonskin cap? There's very few coonskin caps. So I've always had a love for Disney. And Disney, the company, celebrated its 100-year anniversary last year. My remote thing isn't working. See if this works. Nope, that worked. That is, oh, no. So cold, it's frozen up. Yeah. There we go. I'll see. Yep. So the Disney company celebrated its 100th year last year, and having been around for 100 years, it kind of has gone through different waves of popularity and success. So it's usually broken up into a few different time periods. So we usually say it was formed in 1923. The golden age, which we're going to talk about, is usually 1937 to 42, and it usually consists of 5 feature films, which we'll be talking about. Then we have the wartime era, the silver age, which is probably the most successful financially, if you think about it, of the Disney time period. The Bronze Age, sometimes called the Dark Ages. So the Silver Age pretty much ends at the death of Walt Disney, and the company kind of goes through a period in which they're lacking the direction that they had from the beginning. The Renaissance in 1989 to 1999, that's where we get The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Lion King and Beauty and the Beast. The post-Renaissance, 2000 to 2007, the revival era, and then what most people today call the streaming era, I like to call it the evil empire, partially because they seem to have gotten away from their creativity. They've gotten rid of most of their creative people and brought in business people. So now it's kind of all about making money and not necessarily making the best products that they used to make. But that's a whole nother presentation. So let's start with Walt Disney. So he was born in 1901. At the age of 5, his parents moved to Missouri. And it's here in Missouri that he kind of fell in love with a lot of the things that will inspire him for the rest of his life. He falls in love with drawing. His uncle worked on the railroad, and he was able to ride trains around quite a lot, which brought him his love of trains. He went to the circus for the first time, fell in love with the circus, and he really loved the outdoors. He pretty much thought he was just going to be a Midwest farmer or something along those lines. In 1910, his father moved, or well, the whole family, but the father got a job working as a newspaper distributor in Kansas City. And he started being around the newspaper industry, if you will. But in 1917, America enters World War I. Roy and Ray Disney, his two older brothers, went off and enlisted and went to the war. Walt wanted to join them, but since he was only 15 at the time, he was too young to enlist. The following year, in 1918, his mother bought him a passport. I'm not quite sure what she was thinking by buying him a passport, but he took that passport and he changed his birthday on, which made him old enough to then enlist into the army. So he enlisted to be an ambulance driver in Europe. Now, maybe luckily enough for him, he did not make it to Europe until November 18th, which was a week after the armistice. So he never actually saw any, battle per se, but he stayed almost a year in Europe as an ambulance driver. And here's a picture of him next to his ambulance. And I don't know if you can see right over maybe to the right of him, over his shoulder, you can see he has a little kind of caricature that he drew on the side of his ambulance. So already you can kind of see that he has this, as I like to say with my college students, they're always doodling on their papers. This and kind of doodling on his ambulance, if you will. When he came back in 1920, he started working for a newspaper distributor in Kansas City. He wanted to be a comic strip artist. That was his dream. Didn't necessarily work out that way. He started getting more work in the commercial arts. Specifically, he started working on animated things. He started working for the Newman Theater and started doing animated advertisements, if you will, in which he called them laughograms. And these laughograms, again, were somewhat of just advertisements for companies. Oftentimes, he would try to create a story around these commercials, oftentimes incorporating fairy tale characters. So his very, very first laughogram was in 1922, and it was off of Jack and the Beanstalk. And he ended up getting a distributor for these cartoons from the Pictorial Club, and they offered him a $11,100 contract to do these cartoons, which in 1920 is a pretty good chunk of money. He did a couple cartoons for them, again, short little advertisements. Unfortunately, the following year, Pictorial Club ended up going bankrupt. And they only gave him $100 of the $11,100 contract. Because of that, he went into major debt and ended up going bankrupt. So that's a good way to start business, I guess. So by 1922, he was already bankrupt. He was only 21 years old. The following year, him and his closest brother, Roy, closest biologically, he was actually 8 years older than him, decided to form a business of their own called the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio. And they decided that they were going to move out to California. Walt also realized at this time that he really wasn't the best artist, per se. He was a good drawer, but he wasn't a great drawer. He was much better at storytelling, and bringing together groups of people to kind of create ideas. And with that, he started a new idea with this company called Alice's Wonderland. So what this idea was, a lot of studios had already been doing this where they were taking their cartoon characters and kind of putting them into live action in the background. So if you think about something like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, is kind of a great example of, the cartoon character is kind of over the top of live action scenes. Walt decided, what if I take this idea and flip it around and take a live action person and put them into an animated scene? And so Alice's Wonderland is formed. And he had two young female actresses, Virginia Mayo, and my papers are stuck together. Boy, it's very freezing when it's playing here. So it was Margie Gay and Virginia Davis were the two young actresses who starred in these. And they were lovely early cartoons of these female actors kind of running through these animated scenes. And one of the major people that Walt brought in was this man, Ubi Iwerks. Great name. So Ubi was actually a friend of his that he knew from Kansas City, who was a wonderful artist, and brought him out to start working for the Disney Brothers Studio Company. And at this time, there were some very popular cartoon characters. Most of them were centered around cats. I don't know how many of you are into Crazy Cat or Felix the Cat. Those were two of the big ones at the time. So they wanted to create a new cartoon character, and they were sticking away from the cats. So who did they come up with? You'd think it would be Mickey Mouse. It's not Mickey Mouse. It's not Mortimer Mouse, but that was a very good guess. It's actually this character right here, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Anybody know Oswald? A couple of people do. I know my Disney person because he's raised his hand for every single question so far. So Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was created, and Universal Pictures were actually a studio that was looking to distribute cartoons. They were one of the last studios to kind of get involved in it. And Walt realized, well, if they came up with a great character, they could actually sell it to Universal and start having them be the distributor of it. And that's what happened. And Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was actually a very, very popular character and went very popular quickly. And a couple of the ideas were, it was the first cartoon character that really had his own personality. Most cartoon characters at this time were kind of cookie cutters of every other character up to this point. But Walt said, well, each character should have their own walk, should kind of have their own way that they move, should kind of have their own personalities in the sense of, in this case, with having the large floppy ears, they could do different things with the ears there. So it kind of created a personality. He was also one of the first cartoon characters in which he was kind of an everyman. He was a hard worker. He didn't necessarily come from money. And I think more people could relate to him as well. And he quickly became as popular as Felix the Cat, and another big popular person at the time was Coco the Clown, which was another big animated character. Now, I just want to point, so this is just a scene from Oswald the Rabbit. Just notice how simple it is. The background is very, very simple, just simple line drawings. The character itself is rather simple too. But this was how most animated cartoons looked at the time. And I want to just point that out just because as we get to later on in this presentation, how detailed Disney finally gets with this animation. So Walt Disney had done 27 animated cartoons for Universal. In 1928, their contract was coming up, and Disney thought, well, this would be a perfect time to go to Universal in New York City and negotiate a new contract in which they could get some money. They actually had already expanded their studio. They had about 20 animators now in the studio. And they're like, well, this is perfect. We can continue to grow. And when they got out to New York City, instead of getting the raise that he thought he was going to get, Universal told them that they were going to be actually cutting their contract by 20%. Now Disney said, well, this isn't the way this is going to work. And Universal says, well, technically, it is how it's going to work because we own the cartoon character according to our contract. You do not. So if you don't like it, not only are we going to take the cartoon character, but we're going to take some of your animators with you, and we're going to continue to make these cartoons without you. And that's pretty much what happened. So Disney now had lost Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. So Ubi and Walt decided, well, we got to come up with a new character. There's a couple different kind of urban legends about how this came about. One of them says that as Walt was driving in the train back to the West Coast, that he came up with the idea on the train. Some people said that he actually got this idea from some of the mice that used to run around the newspaper plant when he was in Kansas City as a young boy. None of those are really true. They pretty much came back to California, and Walt and Ubi decided to kind of brainstorm different ideas. And they had everything from cats to there was a frog, there was a female cow, kind of all over the place. And what Ubi finally came up with was Mortimer the Mouse. So they thought, well, this is kind of a character that was taken from some early drafts that Ubi had seen that Walt had done. It's like, well, this might be the perfect thing. And as far as we know, this is one of the first drawings of Mortimer the Mouse. Now, Walt showed this around to a couple different people, including his wife. And supposedly his wife said, I love the character. I hate the name. You're going to have to change the name around. And of course, Mortimer the Mouse ends up becoming Mickey Mouse. So some of Mickey Mouse's first cartoons, we have Plain Crazy, which was produced in May 15th of 1928, and The Galloping Gaucho in August of 28. Now, even though those were the first two cartoons that were made, they were never picked up by a distributor at the time. So Walt kept on trying. And he thought, well, maybe we need to do something else to this as well. And I don't want to say add a gimmick to it, but there was this new technology that was coming into play called sound. And they decided that he was going to create a cartoon. Well, first up, I wanted to point these two out. So there's Oswald on the one side, Mickey on the other. You can see the characters are quite similar. Their body shapes are very much the same. They're designed off of circles, which are easier to draw and animate. And the only difference then is instead of the floppy ears of the rabbit, he did round circles for the ears. So really, that's really the only major difference between these two characters. The first cartoon that was actually released and people saw was Steamboat Willie. So most people think of this as the first Mickey Mouse cartoon. And the reason why this was so important is because Walt decided to add synchronized sound to it. So what synchronized sound was, before this time, cartoons had music, but it was just a generic track that went on behind the action. In this case, we actually have sound associated with the cartoon. In this case, Mickey Mouse whistling. This becomes a huge hit. Mickey Mouse almost immediately skyrockets to one of the top animated characters of the time. And of course, if I don't stop this, you're all just going to keep on watching this cartoon for the next 7 minutes. So along with this, these first three cartoons, including Steamboat Willie, another character is added into this as well, and that was a love interest to Mickey Mouse. She was kind of designed after the 1920s flappers of the day, and of course that is Minnie Mouse. A couple different things that I wanted to point out about both Mickey and Minnie is in these early cartoons is you see that they have, they're not wearing gloves yet. So they're going to add gloves pretty early on to these characters. And the problem was is that their hands were black and their bodies were black. So every time they moved the cartoon character's hands in front of the body. You couldn't see the hands anymore. So they said, well, we have to do something. Either we could have to add more clothes to Mickey and Minnie, or we got to do something with their hands. In this case, they added gloves to their hands so that you could see the hands as it moved in front of the bodies. Now, surprisingly enough, is that the fact that Mortimer the Mouse does show up. And that was in 1936. He shows up in a cartoon. Here is Mortimer the Mouse. And he was kind of a rival to Mickey, trying to woo over Minnie Mouse herself. And just to find the name of this, do I have the name of? I almost think it's literally something to rival. I'll see if I can find it as we go. Oh, here it is, Mickey's rival. I thought it was something similar to that. The 1936 Mortimer the Mouse. Another character that shows up, 1930, there was a cartoon called The Chain Gang. It was a bloodhound that was tracking a runaway Mickey Mouse. The bloodhound has no name to him, and this is how he looked. 2 months later, he appears in another cartoon called The Picnic as Minnie Mouse's dog, and his name was Rover. As they started to talk about it, they're like, we kind of really like this character. We would keep on bringing him back. We don't necessarily like the name Rover, though, just because it was such a generic dog name at the time. So by May of 1931, he appears in another cartoon, and it's called Playful Pluto. And of course, this becomes Mickey's character, or Mickey's dog. And of course, that is the beginning of Pluto. Now, interesting enough, Pluto was always just supposed to be kind of a sidekick to Mickey. Later on, he starts having such a personality, people loved him so much that he started having his own cartoons of his own as well. So he comes off and kind of becomes a famous character in and of himself. And then another character in 1932 was Mickey's Review. This is a character right here. He was called Dippy Dog. How many people know Dippy Dog? Nobody knows. Of course, you know Dippy Dog. They kind of like Dippy Dog, but they realize, well, he's a little old and he's a little dippy. So we decided that, just a few months later, he appears once again as a younger character, and they start calling him Goofy in 1932. And this kind of becomes this trio of characters then, Mickey, Goofy, and we'll see Donald just shortly. This trio that appears over and over again in multiple cartoons, and kind of like Pluto, Goofy becomes such a character in and of himself, but by the 40s, he starts having all of his own cartoons simply of himself. But Mickey becomes a huge hit, especially because of the sound. He immediately skyrockets. But Disney also was a master at marketing. And Mickey they start selling him as stuffed animals, as comic books. He had a comic book that ran for 46 years using comic strips. He was, I almost kind of put him in similar to Charlie Chaplin as how famous Mickey and Charlie were, that were known around the world. People just knew these two characters everywhere around the planet. I thought I had another picture in here, and maybe it's coming up, but I just wanted to talk about Oswald the Lucky Rabbit one more time. So in 2006, Universal, that is now owned by NBC, it's NBC Universal. They got the rights to start producing NFL football games on their network at nighttime. And with that, the person that they wanted to broadcast their NFL games was a famous sportsman by the name of Al Michaels, who had a contract with ABC, which is owned by Disney. So NBC and Universal went to Disney and said, we'd like to buy Al Michaels out of this contract. And they said, you know what? We don't want to lose Al Michaels, but you have something that we want. So maybe we can do a swap. And they said, well, what do you want? He said, you still own the rights to Oswald and Lucky Rabbit. We'll do a swap, Al Michaels for Oswald and Lucky Rabbit. Now, I don't know how Al Michaels might have felt about that, being traded for a cartoon character that hadn't appeared in a comic for about 70 years. But that is what happened, and since 2006, Disney now owns the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and he has appeared in a variety, in the parks, he's appeared in a couple contemporary cartoons and some video games as well. So Disney is having huge success with the cartoon, the Fabulous Five, as they call them. Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, Donald, and Pluto. And he was trying to come up with another idea in which to expand, and they came up with the Silly Symphonies. How many people know about Silly Symphonies? Except for my Disney people. A couple people, okay. So, Silly Symphonies, he thought, well, this is a good idea in which I can kind of play around. He was very interested in music and trying to do different ideas around music. He said, this is a great way in which we won't have recurring characters. We'll just kind of do our own ideas for each one of these Silly Symphonies. We'll be able to kind of experiment on different ideas, both with music and with animation. And they ended up doing 75 different Silly Symphonies in a 10-year period of time. The very, very first Silly Symphony is the Skeleton Dance. Again, there was no dialogue to this. It was all just music. And it was just kind of a silly little fun idea of skeletons dancing around to a musical thing. But they would then go on, again, to kind of experiment in a variety of different ways. They would experiment with color. The very, very first animated film ever, Flowers and Trees in 1932. This would also become the very, very first Academy Award winner for a short animated film. Started experimenting in 1933, The Three Little Pigs. The first film to give Disney a #1 hit. Does anybody know what that #1 hit was from The Three Little Pigs? And it also became kind of an anthem for the Great Depression in and of itself. Who does the Three Little Pigs have to fight?
Big Bad Wolf.
Well, who is afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Yes. So Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf became Disney's first #1 hit. And now he's starting to think, oh, wait, I can get into music now too. So this can actually be another thing that helps us out. And then a year later, The Wise Little Hen. The cartoon itself is just rather simple, but it's famous because it was the very first introduction of Donald Duck. So this is where Donald Duck appears, and of course Donald Duck will kind of become his own character in and of itself and start appearing with Goofy and Mickey as the trio. Altogether, the Silly Symphonies ended up winning 7 Academy Awards. It would be a great way to experiment in a variety of different ways with animation. And probably a great example of that is, I should say this too. So during the Silly Symphonies in 1932, Disney actually started their own art school. It's not saying that there weren't great art schools around the country already, but most of them were focused on fine arts. They weren't really teaching animation. And there's kind of a big difference between creating animation and doing a fine realistic portrait of a figure. So Disney creates his own art school on his studio and starts teaching how to do animation. So in many ways, he's literally training his future staff. Within 2 years, he had over 150 students enrolled in the art school. So obviously this was a major thing for him. And he ended up going and trained many of the great artists, not only at Disney, but at MGM, at many of the other studios that were doing animation as well. But probably the best example of one of these silly symphonies is from 1937, The Old Mill. And one of the things that they experimented on this was weather and weather conditions. So they also started experimenting on what was called a multiplane camera, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. The idea of the camera actually moving in and out of animated sets. And in this case, in this scene, the camera actually kind of goes right through that spider web and on into where the windmill is behind it. But experiments with water, with nighttime and lighting like fireflies, and then with storms and lightning. So all brand new ideas that he is experimenting with. And well, can we actually do this in animation? And you see this and you think, well, this isn't even 10 years since those Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons. And I pointed that out, how simple the background was in this. You're talking huge learning curve here that we have just in about a 7-year period of time with the use of color, of sound, of special effects in animation. Now Disney started getting the idea of, well, I should also point out that a couple of these cartoons, so let's see, Three Little Pigs, The Old Mill, and Flower and Trees have all been selected by the Library of Congress to be preserved as National Film Registers. So that is a huge honor as well. So Disney has got all of this experimentation, and they start thinking about, well, at least Walt starts thinking about this idea of, I want to push animation even farther. And I want to actually do a full-length animated film. And even the people in the studio were like, you're nuts. Nobody is going to want to sit through 90 minutes of cartoons. It's just isn't possible. It's also going to cost you way too much money. Mickey cartoons and even the silly symphonies usually run about 7 minutes, somewhere between 6 and 7 minutes, usually costing between, on a cheap side, $10,000, on the expensive side, about $25,000. They figured a full-length feature is going to be at least 4 times that, if not more. And we don't know if we necessarily have the funds to do that. He started experimenting or trying to come up with a couple different ideas. One of them was to expand on this Alice in Wonderland idea that he was doing in earlier days. He came up with the idea of, well, the reason why he didn't go with Alice in Wonderland, another studio had already picked up the rights for it and were hoping to do their own version of it. Other ideas was Rip Van Winkle, a full-length animated version of Babes in Toyland. He had recently picked up the novel Bambi and really wanted to do Bambi, but didn't think his artists were at that level yet from a technical standpoint to create live animals. Thought about the Odyssey, Gulliver's Travel, and by 1934, Disney settled on the Brother Grimm fairy tale of Snow White. Now, there was a live action version of Snow White from 1916, a silent film that Disney had fond memories of. Snow White was also an idea that they had thought about for one of these silly symphonies, but he thought that Snow White would be a good film to kind of expand more on the story, and also thought that the Seven Dwarfs were a great opportunity to add some humor and some kind of slapstick comedy into the film above and beyond the actual story. So he decided to kind of go along with the story. He had a small group of staff members that kind of got together to kind of come up with how to expand the story a little bit more. After a few months, they kind of came together. Walt brought his entire studio together in a large auditorium at the studio, and Walt proceeded to act out the entire story over a 3-hour period of time, kind of acting out all and each of the characters themselves. And again, his fellow workers thought it was kind of a crazy idea. Both his brother Roy and his wife tried to talk him out of it. And even the media, the Hollywood media of the day, thought that this would be Walt's downfall. And they started calling this Disney's folly, with the idea that this would pretty much bankrupt the studio and they never recover from it. As they started to put the story together, one of the things that they were worried about was trying to create realistic or more realistic human characters, which was a challenge. And one of the things that they started doing was a technique called rotoscoping, which means you film actual live actors doing the role, and then you go back in and you start kind of creating the animated version of that live actor. It's a great technique to try to create realistic characters, but suddenly you're now making 2 movies. You're shooting a live action version of it, and then you're converting it into an animated version. So now your budget is going up even more. The dwarves were probably the characters that they kind of played around with the most. Here are early versions of the Disney dwarfs and what they would look like. They had over 50 different variations of what their personalities were going to be. And just a few examples, we have Wheezy, Jumpy, Baldy, Sniffy, Lazy, Puffy, Stuffy, Shorty, Burpy, and Dizzy. I think I would have liked to see a movie of Snow White and the 50 Dwarfs. Actually, that would have been fun. One of the later on versions was this character called Dopey. When they came up with the idea of Dopey, he was going to be a very, very fast, talkative dwarf. And they couldn't really find a voice actor that they felt that went with the character enough. So they went in the opposite direction and just didn't hire a voice actor and decided to make Dopey be mute. And they thought that they would kind of do a version of Harpo Marx, if you think of Harpo, with the idea of just this kind of fun, bubbly, goofy kind of character. And of course, we end up with the 7 famous dwarfs that they came up with. The Evil Queen was interesting. This was the character that the animators seemed to enjoy doing the most. And the reason for that, well, a couple of different reasons. One of them is this was one of the characters that they didn't rotoscope. So because of that, the animators have a little bit more leeway on creativity and imagination. They designed the character off of some of the famous kind of female screen sirens of the time, Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo. And this was the voice actress who did it. Her name is, and I know it's written there, Lucinda Laverny. And she had a wonderful voice, this evil menace to her voice for the Evil Queen. And when she turns actually into the Evil Witch then, Disney thought that they were going to go out and get a different actress to voice the evil witch part. And Lucinda said, "Oh, no, I can do this." And she left the studio for a few minutes and she came back. And the animators were amazed at how she had completely changed her voice around. It sounded like a witch. And they finally asked, like, "How did you do this?" She said, "Well, I simply took my teeth out." And so she appears as the voice actress for both the Evil Queen and the Witch. One of the complaints I often get from people about Snow White is the prince from Snow White. And they say, he really doesn't do anything. He simply shows up at the end of the movie, he gets to kiss the girl, and he rides off in the sunset. And one of the problems for that is, again, this learning curve that the Disney animators had. They had a hard enough time doing Snow White and the Queen already, and they never had enough time to get the Prince. He actually has a much greater story in the story itself. Many scenes that were all ended up being cut because they didn't think they could get the Prince right. But the Prince does have a name. Trivia question, and I'm going to even stump my Disney person here. The name of the prince from Snow White. They called him Prince Buckethead. Exactly. So, to help promote the stories, Disney already had a comic book line, and they started doing a line of Snow White stories to kind of get people ready for the movie coming out. So many of these scenes that the prince was cut out of the movie actually still appear in the comic books. So you can kind of get a greater idea of what the prince actually does then. But in one of the scenes in particular, Snow White was cleaning up one of the gardens of the castle. And she starts having this fantasy about meeting a prince someday. And she creates kind of the scarecrow-like character that is her prince. And the final thing that she does is put a bucket on the top of the scarecrow for his head. And she starts referring to him as Prince Buckethead. Well, the prince is on the other side of the castle wall and hears her singing and kind of comes over and makes his first appearance to Snow White. And, she's all embarrassed and stuff. And he asks her who he is and refers to himself as Prince Buckethead. So for the rest of the story, then, she continues to refer to him as Prince Buckethead. And again, he has a much longer story in what Disney had created. It's just that because of the learning curve, they ended up cutting those parts out altogether. But to give you an idea, I don't know how many people know much about animation, but to create 1 second of film, it takes 24 drawings, which means Snow White was roughly 120,000 drawings to create this animated film. Along with this, the fact that they were filming technically 2 movies, a live action and animated version. And they kept on changing the story to try to add more humor and gags to it throughout the creation of it. Between these 3 things, the budget just continued to skyrocket. Walt Disney took a mortgage out on his house to get the $250,000 that he needed to complete the film. Still didn't have enough. He ended up needing to go get a loan. And he ran a short screening of a very unproduced film so far, what they had together, to executives from the Bank of America. And after that screening, the Bank of America gave him the loan that he wanted and that he needed, and said, one executive said, that thing is going to make a hatful of money, and approved it. So it took them 3 years to complete. It cost $1.5 million. Again, to give you comparisons, again, a Mickey cartoon was about $25,000. Citizen Kane, the great Citizen Kane from 1941, which is 4 years after this film was produced, to give you an idea of that, that was $840,000. So this movie was almost $400,000 more than Citizen Kane was, and it was made 6 years earlier. It's one of the painters working on the cells of the film. At the end of its run, Snow White earns $6.5 million. It was the highest grossing film to that point in time. If you factor into inflation, it's still one of the highest in the top 10 of the highest grossing films ever made, which is pretty amazing. There was such a profit from it that Disney ended up going and buying a 51-acre property in which they were going to build their new studio on. So this film pretty much makes Disney Studios itself. At the Academy Awards, Walt Disney was given a special honorary Oscar. And can you tell who was presenting that to him? Shirley Temple. And I don't know how well you can see this, but here is the Oscar right here, the normal sized Oscar. And then right next to it, standing on a platform, are 7 smaller Oscars. And that was the special honorary Oscar that Disney receives. Again, just for pushing the medium, the art form itself, to such an extreme of anything that had been done before. Now, trivia question, technically, this is not the first animated full-length feature film. Most people think it is. You have to be a little bit more descriptive. This is the first full-length, hand-drawn animated film. There was one film that was produced a few years earlier than this from Europe called Prince Edhem, and it's all done with shadow puppets. But that is an animated film as well, but it wasn't a hand-drawn, so you have to be technical when it comes to some of these questions. So from there, Disney was like, well, I gotta push this even farther now. Again, they were thinking Bambi was gonna be their second film. Again, he didn't think his artists were at that skill level yet. We're still having problems with Prince. So, so they decided to go with Pinocchio. This was actually their third choice. Before I head on into Pinocchio, just a couple quick side notes. I already told you that, so in 1993, Snow White becomes the first film to be entirely scanned and made into a digital film, which is rather interesting. And I did mention its lifetime gross is $418 million. Pretty impressive. So Pinocchio was supposed to be their third feature film. They moved ahead with it and pushed it to number 2. And a lot of changes had to be made. Has anybody ever read the story of Pinocchio? It's very, very different from the Disney version. And many of these stories, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, they're all very different from their original fairy tales. And Walt realized that he had to change Pinocchio around quite a lot. He's kind of a rude character in the book. He's cold, he's ungrateful. So they wanted to kind of make him and create a little bit more innocent and naive character. And again, here's some evolutions of how the character looked. They also wanted to kind of create a companion for Pinocchio that would help him along in his trials, if you will. So they decided to take another character from the story, a little cricket, and in the actual story, the cricket is actually killed by Pinocchio by smashing him with a hammer. That's what happens in the story. Walt decided to go a different direction and kind of take this character of the cricket, giving him the name Jiminy, and kind of him being the conscience of what Pinocchio would be. And here's some early drawings for designs for the picture. I just found these recently, and I think these are like as beautiful of works of art in and of themselves. And these are just, again, just sketches kind of for ideas. And you can see it has a much darker tone than some of his earlier cartoons would be, even just by the way these puppets are hanging, the shadows in the background almost look it's like the people that are being hung themselves. And they wanted to push the direction of special effects. The specialists, so much of it is going to be taken around and underwater. And with all these ideas of continuing to push the art form, the budget for Pinocchio goes up to $2.3 million. So almost double of what Snow White was, which was an extremely expensive film already. I like this little view. So this is showing some examples of these special effects that they're working with. So the top left corner, you have this idea of this magical quality of the fairy. The top right is fire, the idea of bubbles, and the idea of water with the whale. And to this day, I still think the water in this movie probably looks better than any animated film since then. Another idea that the Disney company comes up with, well, they've been working with these with the Silly Symphonies, and here's the multi-plane camera that I talked about earlier with the old mill. And what this is on the very, very top is the camera itself pointing down to the floor. And in each one of these levels, there's a different plane which has a different cell of animation. So with this, you can move those cells in different directions. So the top one, the cell that is the closest to the camera, would appear to be the foreground of a scene. The middle one would be the middle ground, the bottom one, the background. So you can actually have the foreground moving in one direction, the background moving in a different direction to create more of a sense of a depth, space, and reality. And kind of an example of how this looks. Now this was, again, no other studio ever was even thinking of anything like this. And an example of this, so this is the beginning of Pinocchio. Let's see if I can get this started here. And you'll see how the camera seems to slowly pan across the village. And the birds in the foreground flying around. The background is moving at a different speed than the foreground is. It gives you a sense of perspective. It's going to zoom into the city street. It's going to veer off to the right. It's going to go underneath this little walkway, this little bridge here. And then pan over and go into the front of Geppetto's workshop. Something like this is even difficult for live action films to do at this time. So to be able to create this was, again, a huge advancement. Another thing Disney Studios decides to do is they start creating a sculpture shop. So they do sculptures of each of their characters. And what's nice about this is as an animator, well, now you can see what the character might have looked like from underneath or from up on top, which is difficult to kind of think of in your head when you're only working with two-dimensional flat images. So again, continue to advance the idea. Now, you remember how much the budget was for Pinocchio? $2.3 million. Critics absolutely raved about this film. In fact, many still think that this is one of the most beautiful animated films ever. People, not so much. They thought it was a little too dark, as opposed to Mickey cartoons and even Snow White with the fun dwarfs. And it only ends up making $1 million. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, again, people don't necessarily care for it as much, a little darker, but also 1940, you already have the outbreak of World War II in Europe, and Disney can no longer distribute their films in Europe anymore. So because of that, you're starting to lose the international market, and it starts becoming difficult to be making this money. At the same time that Pinocchio is being produced, they start working on their third film, Fantasia, and this is kind of an offshoot of what the Silly Symphonies were. But instead of having these short little 6-7 minute cartoons, Disney thought, well, I could do a much larger piece of classical music. And what I can do is if I do 4 or 5 of these, every year I can produce this film and distribute it and just kind of like a concert, put different pieces in. So this year I might have a Mozart and a Beethoven and a Tchaikovsky piece. And next year I might have a Schubert and Chopin and Stravinsky piece, and kind of have a concert that continually changes. So he had met with one of the conductors, Leopold Stokowski, who loved the idea, and they start working on this. They came up with a variety of different pieces that they wanted to do. And one of the leading things, one of the first ones he started working on was The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And one of the reasons for this is Disney was starting to get worried that Donald Duck and Goofy were starting to become more popular than Mickey Mouse. So he wanted a platform in which to kind of play off of Mickey Mouse, and The Sorcerer's Apprentice was kind of came up with the idea. But what's nice about these is each of these films kind of have each of these segments of films kind of have their own personality and aesthetic to them. Very first one, Bach's Toccata and Fugue. You have Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. First, you have The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I don't know what just happened to my Sorcerer's Apprentice. My piece in there, my paperwork is on the computer too much. There's me. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring with the dinosaurs. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. The Dance of the Hours, which is a dancing ballerina hippo, which is great. And then, of course, The Night on Bald Mountain. All of these very, very different. They created over 100 different characters. I'm sorry, they had 1,000 artists working on this, creating over 500 different characters in the film. He also wanted the best sound possible, so he expanded upon the technology for sound, creating what was called Fantasound. Spent over $200,000 to invent this new sound equipment. It was pretty much the beginning of surround sound that we have in movie theaters today. When he started taking it around the country, if a movie theater wanted to show this film, they had to do an $85,000 upgrade in their technology so that the sound was on par. Now, in its initial run, it made about $1 million. Unfortunately, the budget for this was $2.2 million, and that was partially because of all the money they put in for the development of sound equipment. So now he's had 2 big films that have each lost over $1 million. So he is in trouble. So they decided to produce a film called The Reluctant Dragon. Has anyone ever seen or heard of The Reluctant Dragon? So for the crazy film fans, or the Disney fans here. Yeah, so the Reluctant Dragon. So what the idea of this was Disney came up with the idea of doing a short cartoon called The Reluctant Dragon. But most of the film was a live action. And it was the idea that he would actually have a character go throughout the Disney studio and actually see how an animated film was actually made. So in many ways, this was kind of a commercial for the studio itself. It had an animated cartoon in it. Actually, there were 2 of them in it. And it was a way that they could produce a film that was rather inexpensively to make, but yet could hopefully make money. And that was the case. Funny thing about it is, Walt didn't think that his animators would be very good storytellers on film themselves. So he actually had actors portray the animators in the Disney studio, which I think is kind of funny. And this actually made some pretty good money in which that Disney could continue to work here. And then by 1941, again, they're like, we really still need some more money here. We lost quite a lot. And so they came up with the idea of Dumbo. Again, Dumbo was supposed to be one of these short animated films, and they thought, well, this would be a perfect way to expand to a larger feature-length film and to do things in a much simpler way. The backgrounds of Dumbo are very simple compared to Pinocchio and Snow White. The character design is rather simple. There's very little dialogue in Dumbo compared to these other films. So it was made, gosh, the budget for this, $950,000 was the budget for this, which was half the cost of their last two films. So you cut the budget. It's the shortest animated film that they did at 64 minutes. So much shorter. It has a much more playfulness about it. Audiences loved it. It made some pretty good money. Unfortunately, again, they didn't really have the studios in other countries to expand it even further. It probably would have made even more money. But the film would gross $1.6 million. It had a few different memorable songs to it, especially Baby Mine, which is probably the one most people think of. And it was the most financially successful Disney film from the 1940s. And again, they had lots of trouble during the war years as far as they weren't really producing a lot of financial films. And then the last movie that kind of falls in this golden age, and that is Bambi. So they finally get to Bambi. They pretty much have been working. This was an idea going all the way back from, as possibly their first film. But their artists were kind of much more skilled at this, especially with Fantasia doing a lot of animal characters in there. And again, they brought in these animals to the studio in which the artists were working live from the animals themselves. Had a lot of different effects. Again, it was the first animated film that showed all 4 seasons. So it goes from spring to summer to fall to winter. Despite somewhat poor reviews of the film, and because of the World War I still going on, it was profitable. It earned about $3 million worldwide, and it was the 3rd highest film up to that point, with a budget of about $858 million. Now, even though we call this Disney's golden age, it really kind of depends on what we mean by that. And what I mean by golden age is as far as artistic ability. Many of these films are still seen as, some of the best animated films ever produced. Financially, that isn't the case. The Silver Age is really going to be Silver and the Renaissance in the 80s. Were really the times that Disney were making the most money from their films and not necessarily the profits. And it's also interesting because most people think of these as they're animated, they must be G-rated. These were really before the rating system was actually done. These films, if you look at them, are quite dark. There actually is an animated scene that Disney cut out of Bambi, in which it actually shows Bambi with his dead mother, which even just the picture of it is just so heartwarming and sad. It's sad enough just imagining her being shot off in the background, but actually to see it, which they did cut it out. But if you think about these films, so Snow White, you have the witch, you have this terrible death. You have Pinocchio smoking and drinking, being turned into animals. You have Night of Old Mountain with the skeletons flying in. You have even Dumbo getting drunk and having these hallucinations. And then of course, Bambi, having her mom being shot. I mean, these were traumatic things that would probably be PG or PG-13 today if this was rated. But so it's really more the artistic qualities of these films than anything. And with World War II going on, Disney would have a difficult time, raising money and making the money that they had been making. And they start getting into a lot more promotion for the war effort.